It's time for another round of PatGPT is brought to you by FOMO Sapiens, the podcast for entrepreneurial thinkers. It's the show where I, Patrick J. McGinnis, share some of my own entrepreneurial thinking in the form of inspiration, practical ideas, and knowledge that you can use at work and in your daily life. And our topic today is fusion voting. Okay, ready to go. Start generating. Now, I wanted to talk about fusion voting because this season is all about creativity. And this is a creative way to make voting work better. And so we're going to talk about that with somebody who is an expert. And as you know, I love political innovation, and the election season in the US is right around the corner. So I'm joined today by Dan Cantor, who co-founded the New York Working Party's family and served as the party's national director from 1998 to 2018. Prior to forming that, he spent 2 decades as a community organizer, labor organizer, and political organizer. And nowadays, he is working at the Center for Ballot Freedom. So I want to welcome you to PatGPT, Dan Cantor.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. Before we get into the topic of fusion voting, Dan, you've been at the front lines of democracy for a long time. So give us a little sense of your background.
So I'm pretty old now, but I've had a long career in what I think of as the sensible social democratic left, meaning people who want to use the power of government to kind of, mitigate some of the inequalities that come in a market society. We want the dynamism of a market society, but we also want outcomes, advance equality as well. So that had me start my work in the 70s with Acorn, well-known group that kind of blew up in the late aughts when the Breitbart people went after them hard. Was a union organizer, worked for Reverend Jackson on both of his presidential campaigns, and then formed the Working Families Party, co-founded it in the late 90s. This is a third party of a different type, which we'll get to in a moment. But that was my work for 20 years, Working Families Party in New York, then spread to Connecticut, now active in about 15 states across the country. I stood down as director in 2018 and have been working since then on democracy reform itself, mostly working with moderate Republicans around America who are dismayed by what they see in their former party, or sometimes it's still their party. So they're dismayed by Trump and Trumpism, but they are not at home in the Democratic Party. And neither was I. I was always a little bit to the left of the Democratic Party, but I didn't want to waste my vote. And that's what attracted me to this idea of fusion voting. So that's what I have spent my life working on. And it's one of these things where at long last, you're an overnight success after, 35 or 40 years, because the circumstances that we're living through demand some innovation, demand some new ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. It's like, my entire life until this year, I hadn't even really heard of fusion voting. And now I've been learning a ton about it. And for folks who are listening who say, I have no idea what that is, which is probably most everybody, why don't you explain what the heck fusion voting is and how it differs from the usual kind of system?
Okay, so this is pretty easy to explain. What's the problem with third parties in our system? Why don't they succeed? And the answer is because they're basically for fools. There's no way in our two-party, winner-take-all, first-past-the-post election for third parties to do very much of anything useful. It's not like a proportional system. In a proportional voting system, just to remind listeners, if you get 11% of the vote, that means you'll get 11% of the seats in the legislature. Under our system, if you get 11% of the vote, you get 11% of nothing, which is nothing, which is why voters will not waste their time and money on third parties. We see it time after time after time. People will say, oh, they're tired of the two-party system, which they are, but they're not stupid. Most voters are not stupid. And when you say to them, well, no, I really want you to vote for this third-party candidate with no chance of winning at all, most people will say, no, that's not a good use of my time and money and my vote. That's not true in the fusion states. There are only 2 now, Connecticut and New York, in which fusion voting is still legal and common, but it was once common in all 50 states. And here's what it is in a nutshell. Fusion means more than one party can nominate the same candidate. So you could be running as a Republican, but also be nominated at the same time as the candidate of the Conservative Party in New York. There's a small Conservative Party, gets about 4 or 5% of the vote every election. But they don't want to run standalone candidates for office with no chance of winning. Same as working families didn't want to run, useless novelty candidates who no one had ever heard of. Instead, what minor parties do in a fusion system is they cross-nominate or fuse on a major party candidate, but say to that candidate and that major party, we're going to deliver 6%, 8% of the vote. We want some of your attention and concessions in return for our votes. And this has a very long pedigree in American history, which I think listeners will be amazed and even delighted to hear about. When you look back at the 19th century, consider abolition in the pre-Civil War era. You're living in the North somewhere, in Massachusetts, Northwest Ohio, upstate New York, and you're an abolitionist. The two major parties at the time were the Democrats and the Whigs. Democrats were pro-slavery, and the Whigs were kind of mixed. They had some anti-slavery people and some pro-slavery. Mostly they didn't want to talk about it. What do you do if you're an abolitionist? Well, in some cases, you could run a standalone candidate if the abolitionist sentiment was strong enough. But in more cases, you would say, well, this Whig is better than this Democrat. So vote for him, and it was all hims back then, vote for him on the Liberty Party line, on the Free Soil Party ticket, they call them, on the anti-Nebraska ticket, and let them know that you want them to be better on slavery. You want them to be stronger in their advocacy to ending slavery. And so slowly over time, more and more fusion candidates got elected. Eventually, the Whigs collapsed because of internal tensions on slavery, and the new Republican Party formed in Wisconsin in 1854. Who went to that first meeting? Well, it was the Liberty Party ticket guys. It was the Free Soil people. It was the anti-Nebraska people. So think of fusion as a way for a minor party to be independent but relevant. It's easy to be independent and irrelevant. That's not what you're interested in, it seems to me. You want to be independent and relevant. And fusion solves the wasted vote and spoiler problem that otherwise makes third parties ridiculous.
FOMO. Yeah, I can't. First of all, speaking of ridiculous, I can't believe there's an anti-Nebraska party. Poor Nebraska. Who's picking on Nebraska? I mean, geez. But it makes sense to me. The idea here, just is that you have not everybody wants to be a Democrat or Republican. Well, I want to be an independent, for goodness sake, because, I like that. But at the same time, voting for an independent or a third party, I mean, occasionally, like in my home state of Maine, we had an independent governor, for example, but that's very rare. And so you have this different party, but it attaches itself to one of the candidates, gets that candidate's attention to make sure that candidate says, listen, I'm going to make sure that I take your concerns into account when I am, governing or running and all that sort of stuff. And it gives people more leverage, and it kind of doesn't force them into a party where they don't have as much leverage. So it makes a lot of sense. Now, how is it, in this day and age, like you've done this with the Working Families Party, like what are you working on now? What's the
so right now there's a really interesting experiment underway right now on Long Island that we're watching closely. So as you know, there's a big fight underway for control of the House of Representatives. Views will differ, but I certainly come down on the side that wants to see pro-democracy forces in charge of the House, right? I'm now working with moderate Republicans. They're all over the country, but on Long Island, what they've done is they formed something called the Common Sense Party, the Common Sense ballot line in 3 congressional districts on Long Island, where there are MAGA or MAGA-affiliated Republicans running, and there are kind of moderate, middle-of-the-road Democrats running. In those 3 districts, the Common Sense organizers have gathered the signatures to create a ballot line, have to gather a fair number of signatures, 8 or 9 or 10,000 per district, something like that, to get their candidate on the ballot. That candidate, in this case, it's 3 different Democrats, Avalon in the 1st district, Swazi in the 3rd, Gillen in the 4th. And each of those candidates accepted the nomination of the Common Sense Party. You can't nominate someone against their will. They must accept it. If the Ku Klux Klan wants to nominate you, my advice is don't take the nomination. Right?
Yes.
You're not required to take it. In this case, these Democrats, I think, were savvy enough to realize, yeah, there's definitely some independents and Republicans in my district who maybe don't love the Democratic Party, but they think well of me. Or there are some Democrats in my district who feel like the National Democratic Party is drifting too far to the left. Whether that's true or not is a different conversation. But in any case, why, just as you were saying, why would you expect 330 million Americans to fit into just two boxes? There definitely is a desire for more choice in politics, but it has to be via a party system that allows that choice, that third or fourth choice, to be a meaningful one. You don't want to waste your vote. You don't want to spoil the election. You want to vote your values. I want to vote for this person who's running in the fourth CD, but I want her to know what's really important to me is common sense public problem solving, reaching across the aisle, protecting our freedoms, and so on. So that's what fusion voting does. It solves the wasted vote, it solves the spoiler problem, and it allows voters to vote their values by saying, I'm a certain kind of voter. I'm a common sense voter, and I want you, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. I think there are two Republicans running for state legislature who also are running under the common sense label.
Wow.
So common sense is, in a sense, the fulcrum in these races. And the fulcrum is a powerful place to be in politics. If you are delivering the last 5 or 7% that gets someone across the finish line, as you said, that's leverage.
It's cool because I like the idea that you have people who are traditionally Democrats or Republicans kind of working under the same place, because that just creates the chance for more collaboration. But what I wonder, so Dan, I've been around politics for a little while, and there's one thing I know, it's that politicians don't like more competition. They want less competition. And you mentioned earlier that this used to be pretty standard, like the anti-Nebraska party. And nowadays it's only in 2 states. So something tells me that the parties have found a way to keep this down. What is the story there, and what can you do? I mean, this is what you're working on now. Like, what's the vision, and what can be achieved? Like, how do we get this to be more common?
Right. So fusion, once legal in every state and very well known in every election of the 19th century. There were lots of different minor parties all over the country that were constantly cross-nominating candidates. Sometimes running standalone candidates when they got strong enough, but generally using fusion. Beginning in the 1890s, the 2 major parties decide they've had enough. They don't like these minor parties. They kind of nibble away at them. You know, they want things in return for their 5, 10, 15%, right? And the major parties in the North, the Republican Party banned fusion. This is in the post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, really, in which Democrats and populists were uniting. They were uniting in the so-called Worker-Farmer Alliance. And the Republicans, which was the dominant party in the North and West, said, we're tired of this alliance between our enemies. So they simply said, they passed laws in one state after another, beginning in Iowa in 1895, and then Michigan in 96, and then one after another. It took about 25 years until 1921 to basically ban fusion in almost every state, simply by saying no candidate may appear under the ballot under more than one party label. Our belief is that this is a very severe violation of the freedom of association. Patrick and his friends ought to be able to form a new political party of their own choice and choose the champion they want to have represent you on the ballot, whether or not that candidate enjoys the support of a bigger, better known party, because you have different set of values that you want to signal to voters. That's what parties do. They signal to voters who stands for what. And you're not a Democrat, you're not a Republican, but you don't just want to be a free-floating independent. You want to be a party so that you can actually signal to that candidate, my vote is coming in for you under this different label, and you need to pay attention to it. And a smart politician, and one thing politicians want to do is win re-election. They will say, okay, I'm going to come in for my meeting with Patrick and his party because they delivered, 9,000 votes, and I only won by 6,000. So that's pretty important. So the 2 major parties banned it. In the South, it was banned by Democrats. Remember, the Republicans banned it in the North because they didn't like Democrats and populists fusing. In the South, the Democrats banned it because they didn't like Republicans and populists fusing in the South against the Jim Crow Democrats. And there were a few examples of quite remarkable Republican meaning recently enfranchised black men, and populists, meaning poor white farmers, uniting in North Carolina is the most famous example, but also Virginia, electorally after the Civil War. But it gets undone by terror, by the Klan terror in the 1880s and 1890s. So our challenge now is we need to revive this. Because it was banned by statute, it can be unbanned, either by passing a law, very challenging because you're asking the two major parties to create new centers of power. So the strategy we're following is litigation. Mm-hmm. We are suing under the state constitutions of various states because many states have excellent, even more robust language on freedom of association than the U.S. Constitution. And we'll find out whether these state courts think that we're right. The first state we sued in was New Jersey. The second is Kansas. There are 2 or 3 more coming down the pike later this year. So we should have 4 or 5 lawsuits going by early next year. And we're optimistic that because this crisis of hyperpartisan polarization is so well known, so visible, even the justices of the various state Supreme Courts ought to be able to understand we can do better. And this is a tried and true, it's like say it's American, is gun violence. This is an old-fashioned system we've had for a long time. We can bring it back and see if we can't have a little more coalitional politics, because that's what you were talking about when it incentivizes coalition building.
FOMO. Yeah, totally. For folks that want to help, that say, "Wow, this is awesome, Dan," what can they do?
So they should visit the website of the Center for Ballot Freedom, all spelled out, long phrase, centerforballotfreedom.org. There's a lot of information there, and you sign up, get on our newsletter, and if you're living in a state where we are organizing to win such a lawsuit, and there's a lot of teaching people and educating people about a new voting system that was once familiar. Everybody's grandparents voted in fusion systems, or great-grandparents, as the case may be, but we have to bring it back. And we're optimistic that once people get used to it, they really like it. People like casting a vote with a bit more meaning. And in fact, it works. It works on the right, it works on the left, but where it's needed at the moment is in the center, because those are the people who are, in essence, most politically homeless, a little bit confused, but we need them to vote. And so if there were a vibrant party of the center, pro-democracy would, I think, be the fault line question for people, meaning, believe in the peaceful transfer of power and so on. That would be a very powerful new contribution to political life and to the kind of coalitional work. I joke with I didn't grow up with Republicans, in my daily life, right? Everybody was a Democrat. But now I work with moderate Republicans, and we joke, soon enough, we can get back to arguing about high marginal tax rates. But for the time being, let's make sure we have a strong democracy, a multi-party democracy.
Yeah, and if we get this passed in all 50 states, that's my entree to establish the FOMO party, which I'll be calling you for help with.
Aha.
So that's the big vision. But no, it's really cool. And everybody, the good thing about politics, and especially something like this, is if you truly are excited, if you're listening right now and you're fired up, head over to centerforballotfreedom.org, because you can get involved, right? I mean, this is the thing.
Absolutely.
Politics is open to everybody. This isn't about needing to be some billionaire with some PAC. This is about getting your hands dirty, getting involved in the movement, and getting involved in something you think can make a positive change.
I will say that in New Jersey, the New Jersey Moderate Party, which is bringing the first major fusion lawsuit to legalize fusion in New Jersey in 100 years, 6 people around a table figured out how they formed it. And it's like, now, and if the court rules in their favor, it will be an earthquake in New Jersey politics, and lots of people who never heard of, they'll be able to take advantage of it. So I think you're totally right. Politics is about groups, and even small groups can have a lot of oomph if they have a good strategy. And we believe this is one such strategy.
All right. Dan Cantor from the Center for Ballot Freedom. Thanks for being here.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate it.
And I will see you all Thursday with a new episode of FOMO Sapiens. But until then, take care of yourselves, FOMO Sapiens, and PatGPT, stop generating. FOMO Sapiens is recorded in New York City. Theme music is by Mike McGinnis, and editing and post-production is by Josh Elstro. If you like today's show, please be sure to rate it and recommend it to your friends. And as always, you can find me at FOMOSapiens.com and at PatrickMcGinnis.com. To advertise on FOMO Sapiens, reach out to contact@FOMOSapiens.com.